Nintendo has been around for ages, starting revolutions in the gaming industry as well as witnessing them. And in all those years, they have been improving the titles they have been releasing in multiple ways, from their style to gameplay elements. However, another thing that changed a lot throughout the years is the graphical design, quality and style, going from something basic and limited to a standard that almost no other video game company can rival. So let's find out how all of this evolved in terms of design, story, gameplay and use. But first, today's sponsor, AFK Arena. This is a great mobile RPG game with a unique art style where you fight, train your heroes, forge weaponry, and unite with other players. And it's also free to download and available on iOS and Android, and you can use my link below to download the game yourself. The game is simple, so you won't spend hours just understanding the basics. However, that doesn't mean there's no depth to its mechanics and gameplay. Aside from that, it has great story building with a classic tale of life versus death, stories and legends linking different heroes, and more. And the game has been out for a year now. So to celebrate, they've introduced a new character, Ukyo Tachibana from Samurai Showdown. This is a classic 2D fighting series that started all the way back in 1993, with the most recent one being released in 2019. And I even own that game. So use my link below to download AFK Arena, because this upcoming weekend, all players who log into the game will get 50 Hero Summoner Scrolls for free. And also, when you use the code AFK888 in-game, you will get 300 diamonds and 3 elite heroes for free as well. So do it now! And also, thanks AFK Arena for sponsoring this video. Now, it all started in the glorious year of 1985 with the game Super Mario Bros. For the NES, a title that left a huge impact on the gaming industry by saving it from the video game crash of 1983, becoming a gigantic hit, selling a whopping 40 million copies. Which is an insane number, to be honest. It introduced great things to the series, like power-ups, classic enemies like Little Goombas, and even Bowser and Peach. But another thing it did was shift the gameplay away from its single-screen arcade predecessor, Mario Bros., and instead featured side-scrolling platforming levels. This is a style where you move from left to right and look at the action from a side-view camera angle, making it clear for the player where he needs to go to, but it also makes it a bit linear. We first saw this style in shoot-'em-up games in the late 70s and early 80s. Think of titles like Sega's Bomber, an arcade game from 1977. So Nintendo wasn't the first to ever do this. They were actually relatively late to the party. They weren't even the first to use this style in combination with a platformer. The first scrolling platformer game was Jump Bug, which was released in 1981. So they were ahead by quite a number of years. Now, since the hardware at the time wasn't really powerful and also limited in a lot of ways, Nintendo went with a 2D 8-bit pixel art style. When making the game, their goal was to have a character travel through many different lands with all kinds of different themes. And it would feature a diverse amount of terrain such as land, water, and even the sky. And the developers did some interesting things to make this world a reality, like coloring the background blue in some levels. Now, while this might seem normal today, and maybe even expected, back then it was unusual, because video games released during this time period usually had a black background to avoid eye strain and to avoid getting distracted by the bright colors. But in the end, none of this mattered, because it just worked, and it caused no problems, allowing them to make more colorful worlds in the end. When designing the stages, a level creating tool wasn't available to them at the time, which is pretty crazy and unusual. So Miyamoto and Tezuka would draw the levels on graph paper, and then their team would take those and would design and program it into the game, with them working on this stuff late into the night. Now, while they did get an insane amount of things they wanted into the game, they also had to compromise, since they had to recycle some assets because they ran into a problem. There was a limited amount of storage on the cartridge, which became such a big problem that they had to reuse assets even. A classic example of this that almost everyone knows about is the fact that the water and lava in the game are the exact same. The only difference is the color. Now, while that is a bit of a basic but great example, there are a lot more of them in the game. Why do you think there's a green and red version of the Koopa Troopa? They most likely made those for the same reason. However, despite those storage and console power limitations, they made an amazing game that pushed boundaries in the industry, and in the next games they took it a step further, with Super Mario Bros. 2 and 3 still being seen on the NES, but they were able to expand on the game greatly. While the pixel count was still low and the sprites were rough, they were able to add more different things to the game, as well as more detail, making these later games look a lot better than the first one. However, after this, Nintendo could finally take the next step, because they released a new and more powerful console known as the SNES. And in games like Super Mario World, it allowed them to finally create things they were never able to make, like Yoshi, which they wanted in a title since the very beginning. Miyamoto was really pushing that, and was quite excited about it. Now, while they did have a more difficult time working with new and more advanced hardware, they did gain a lot from it. Miyamoto even acknowledged that the team no longer had restrictions on certain mechanics such as scrolling and the number of colors they could implement. They even ported Super Mario Bros. 3 to the SNES as an experiment, and it felt like the same game to them, but with improved colors and sprites. And so, thanks to this new power, they could create a game that looked significantly better than the previous ones. They were able to increase the pixel count, making all the sprites and things seen twice as detailed compared to the first title. Now after this, a lot changed. Nintendo started to move away from the 2D pixel art style and started to make 3D games. Their new console, the Nintendo 64, allowed them to do this, and so Super Mario 64 was born. This time the world is colorful and detailed as always, but what's new is that it's all rendered in 3D and the world is completely open. It's not a side-scroller anymore, so it was quite different compared to any previous games seen in the series. Now these 3D graphics were created using the Nichimen N-World toolkit running on a Silicon graphics working station. And for this game, Miyamoto's guiding design philosophy was to include more details than earlier games, using the Nintendo 64's power to feature all the emotions of the characters. Which is completely new of course, because it's hard to pull something like that off with 2D pixel art. He likened the game's style to a 3D interactive cartoon. Some details were even inspired by the developers' personal lives. For example, the boos are based on assistant director Takashi Tezuka's wife, who, as Miyamoto explained, is very quiet normally. But one day she completely exploded, maddened by all the time Tezuka spent at work. Which explains why the boos hide when you look at them and become more scary when you look away. However, while all of this was quite new for Nintendo, they actually did a couple of things during development that might seem weird, but were really important. For example, the team placed high priority on Mario's movement, and before levels were created, they tested and refined Mario's animations on a simple grid. And during some of this testing, they probably found some flaws, which led to an interesting change in design. Because to assist players with depth perception, the team positioned a foul shadow directly beneath each object regardless of the area's lighting. Assistant Director Yoshiaki Koizumi described the feature as an ironclad necessity, which might not be realistic, but it's much easier to play. So some things that are weird design-wise were actually put in to improve gameplay in some way or another. And when it comes to a lot of the worlds and designs seen in the game, Nintendo was actually quite free and crazy, making for some of the weirdest looking designs and things ever seen in a Super Mario game up until that point. In general, Nintendo did a great job with their first 3D Super Mario title, and would improve on a lot of things seen in the first title in later games when more powerful hardware became available, even creating weird demos like Super Mario 128 to show off what they could do with the new GameCube. And so, titles like Super Mario Sunshine were born, where quality was improved, and Nintendo went with a more tropic art style. However, Nintendo started to do something truly new with the style and design of their games when New Super Mario Bros. Came out. With this game, they wanted to bring back the old style from the 80s and 90s. However, this time with a more modern look. And so this game will be played in 2D, but actually uses 3D models to create a 2.5D look and feel. And in general, the game's designers were given much more freedom with designs in New Super Mario Bros. Compared to the previous 2D Mario titles. Characters, enemies, and objects could now be created with much more detailed animations, without requiring that they had to be designed by hand. They also ended up doing some great things with them from both a design and gameplay perspective. for example the Womps. And to provide visual cues, the developers made the game's camera more dynamic. It zooms in and out of action, depending on the situation to provide focus where necessary. So while the 2D titles of old did make a return, they were different, modernized, and also more surprising thanks to the 3D elements, which would continue in later games like New Super Mario Bros. Wii and U. That also improved the graphical quality up to high quality HD. However, in the next 3D game, Super Mario Galaxy, they did something completely new with its design. It's all set in space, and thanks to this they can do something really cool, creating small worlds on the planets we can visit, allowing Nintendo to make completely different locations, which we see in a lot of the game's worlds actually. It can start off as some sort of beach paradise, and on the next planet it becomes a frozen wasteland, which is exactly what we see in Beach Ball Galaxy. So yet again, Nintendo's design team was let loose to create some interesting assets and locations in general, finally doing something new and surprising when it comes to the graphical and overall design of the worlds. However, things started to become a bit stale after this. The 2D games just went on with the whole 2.5D trend, and the 3D titles had some small new themes here and there, but nothing on the level of the Galaxy games. Don't get me wrong, games like Super Mario 3D World and Land still look amazing, but nothing very surprising happened. The only game where we saw an interesting new overall theme was in Super Mario Odyssey. Here, travel inspired their design choices, as well as taking inspiration from Super Mario 64 and Sunshine. And this stuff had an impact on everything, from worlds to the coins that can be found within these places. Take New Donk City for example. This place clearly took inspiration from New York City, and they also did some crazy things when it comes to shapes. Just look at the Luncheon Kingdom. Everything is a polygon. But that's sadly enough where our story ends. Clearly Nintendo has gone through some phases when it comes to designs and graphics, starting off with a limited amount of options and ending up with everything a designer would ever want in a video game.